Welcome to second module where we are going to talk about Amazon IAM service. So in this module, we will be discussing on why exactly we need to have a control on access management and what exactly IAM is, what exactly is the goal of IAM and the components of IAM as a service. So we need to protect any system, any company from any unauthorized and unauthenticated usage, because if someone is going to log into account and they perform some unauthorized actions, which they shouldn't be, then that is going to hamper the entire performance of the application. They may even delete certain applications. They may even delete the entire account, which is going to be a disaster for us as a company. That is why we need to have a complete access control, and we should be limiting when exactly we should have a complete limit when we want them to have the access, how they should be accessing, when, and what kind of permissions they can conduct. So these all things are what we need to control as a company. And only those who are going to have the access to certain services, they will be allowed to work on those components accordingly. For example, if we are going to have someone in the security department, then that person should not be having the access to company finances and so on. So these all things should be limited. And that is what we do by using the concept of IAM service. So any company, or we can say every company, needs to have this kind of setup defined, without which we will not be able to secure it. We'll be simply leaving it vulnerable to other users to hack into it. So IAM is basically the core service offered by AWS, which allows us to create a control access to all the users, services that we have in our account. For example, if we have 50 IAM users, those who we have added, those who are required to work on different services, they will be allowed to work only on those services. They will be able to perform only those actions that we are going to allow. If they try to perform any other action in any other service, then that is going to be by default denied, because as an administrator, we cannot keep a check exactly on whatever actions they are doing. That's why we simply allow them a certain list of actions, and they have to work within that boundary. If they perform any other action which is outside the boundary, the list of actions that we define, then they will be denied to perform those actions. And that kind of control is what we can have by using IAM service. So here it's more like a framework where we can have multiple policies added, and we can use those policies to secure all the digital assets that we have the permission to work with. So the eventual goal of IAM is to provide a single sign-on systems, or what we refer as SSO. So being the IAM user, we can log into the account, and then based on whatever permissions we have given, we will be able to go ahead and update that accordingly. That's how it's going to be. So whatever application we have defined, suppose the client, or we can say the end user, has been tasked with managing 3 applications. So we can mention these applications in something called as a policy, and then we can have it assigned to that specific user, so that this user will be allowed to work only on the given services which have been listed as a part of the policy, because these things are all going to be part of a single policy itself. So whenever we are going to say, okay, this is going to be part of policy, so we are going to define that this user will be able to perform which all actions on these 3 applications. Applications are basically, they can say, we define the access to certain services, because when they are going to set up multiple applications, they will need the access to multiple services only. For example, EC2 or S3 or EBS volume, RDS databases, and so on. So we give permission for them to work on these specific applications itself. And then we define the 2-factor authentication. That means using the account. For example, when we are going to add any user, so we generate the login credentials for that user. And using that login credentials, the user can log into the account. And we can also go ahead and set up the 2-factor authentication, or we can also set up a multi-factor authentication as well. So using that, we will be able to add the authentication to the user, and once the device has been approved, then only they will be allowed to log into our account, else the access is going to be restricted. And we can even choose if we want to give them the access to log into console, or we want to allow them to work with AWS services just by using a CLI. So we can choose accordingly. That is what we have in terms of multi-factor authentication. So if someone gets the unauthorized access to their mail and password, and just by knowing the name and password, they can get the unauthorized access to the account, which is not going to be recommended. That's why what we do is we simply add a third party, or I can say third notification component. For example, we allow them to have the access to the authenticator application, or if we do have the device available. So these are all going to be a part. So these are 4 core components of IAM service. First of all, we have user. So user is the one that we onboard into our account. For example, as a founder, we have set up our company. But as a founder, we are not going to do everything on our own. We are going to make a team. And then as a team, we are going to hire multiple users. For example, user one will be tasked with managing the storage. User two will be tasked with managing all the configuration services, and same before user three and so on. So these are all going to be considered like an IAM user. Now, once we are done adding the user, so we can place them into groups. Now, groups are same like having departments in IAM service. So when we are going to create any company, we are going to define departments. For example, we will be having a finance department, security department, management, operations, and then we can simply start adding users into those departments so that they can have some specific actions accordingly. So in groups, we limit the users' activities by using something called as policies. So policies are nothing but again simple JSON format document where we can define which all actions are going to be allowed, and that too on which all resources. So basically we have 4 category of actions. We have read, write, listen, tag. So every service in AWS, all those 250 plus services, they have predefined actions in these 4 categories. So we assign the policy to a specific group, or we can even assign them to a user directly. And we assign them to a group. That means now whichever user we are going to add in that group, for example, suppose if we add user 2, user 1 and user 2 both to this group, then again, they both will be having the access to work on these specific actions defined accordingly. So that they will be able to have the action. Suppose this is going to give you the access to RDS service. Then both the users will be having a collective address to RDS based on whatever policy we have assigned here. And the policy can be attached either to a group or either to a user. And it's always recommended to attach the policy to a group so that we can maintain a uniformity in terms of user access. For example, suppose if you want to give the same permission to 10 users. So instead of attaching permissions to those different 10 users separately, what we can do is we can go ahead and attach permissions to our group, and then we can simply add the user to the group so that we can allow them to have the permissions accordingly. That's how it's going to be. And then we have roles. So roles are basically allowed to grant access to one resource to manage and perform actions on the other resource. For example, we had deployed one application on EC2 instance that needs to fetch data from one of the S3 buckets deployed. So here, these two are 2 resources which are going to communicate to each other. So in this case, role will be needed. So we have to create a role, and in this role, we can attach whatever required policies we need to get. For example, we want the instance to read permission from S3. So here we can attach a policy giving read permission to S3, and then this policy can be attached to the resource which is going to make a request. So in this scenario, this EC2 instance will be making the request, and then we can attach this policy to this resource. So when the same request is being made to the S3 bucket, it is going to check for the role. If the required role is there, then the permission is going to be allowed, else it is going to be rejected. So that's how these 4 components of IAM, they all work together in terms of setting up a complete control on how the users and services and resources, they are going to be communicating to each other. That's how it works. So as we had discussed, so first thing first, we have users. So we can add IAM users who can have the access to AWS services in our account. So we can create the IAM user when there's a new employee who needs to work on certain services in our account. And a collection of IAM users is what we refer as a group. And then in a specific group, we can attach multiple permissions. A single group can even have up to 10 different policies. So these can be the predefined managed policies given by AWS that we refer as AWS managed policies, or they can be customized policies as well, where we can have a control on what kind of permissions they should be having. So we can have a control over that. And then we can have groups based on our own requirement. For example, we can have a group of users who are those who are going to be the administrators, or we can have a group of users who are going to be working as a developer or as a storage manager. So we can assign the permissions accordingly. And then we can keep on adding the users who are going to work, and those who need to have the access of same permission, they can be placed in the same group. And a single user does not need to be limited to a single group. A single user can be a part of multiple groups as and when needed. Now, next we have the policies. So policies are JSON format documents where we can define which all policies, which all permissions, and those permissions will be allowed on which all resources. We can have a complete control over that. And once we're done with this, then we can simply have a control. Okay, this is going to be the policies, and policies can be attached to the users or groups directly. Or if we want to allow, we can say resources to communicate to each other, then we allow the policies to be added to resources via roles only, because policies cannot be attached directly to resources. So we create a role, we attach policies to the role, and then those roles are going to be attached to the resources. That's how this will be. And in roles, we can define who is going to have the access, what actions the user will be having the access to. For example, Paul can have the access to perform, we can say, read or add objects to S3 bucket. And then under the AWS resources, we can define, suppose if we have 10 different buckets, so the user will be having the access to which specific bucket. And then we can define till when they should be able to have the access, so that we don't have to remove the permission manually. The permission is going to automatically expire after a given date or time, and whether we want to allow or whether we want to deny the permissions, we can define that. And there are two different type of policies that we have in AWS service. We have a managed policy where we can have it as a default policy that we can attach to multiple entities, like we have users, groups, roles in our account, or we can have a new policy defined out of the managed policies as well. We can even have an inline policy created where we can define the permissions based on specific type of actions. For example, we can define some inline policies which are going to be attached to the specific user or group, just like we have internal style sheet, we have inline CSS. So these are all core components of IAM, and we'll be looking at the deployment and provisioning of these resources in our further modules. Thank you for watching.